I wasn't looking for wars when I found the anomaly. I was researching land surveys, specifically trying to understand why so many official government records from the early 1800s described cities with existing infrastructure, roads, water systems, and drainage channels that the survey teams didn't build and couldn't explain. These findings were filed under terms like prior works or pre-existing formation, then abandoned in the official record without further investigation. That phrase kept appearing, already established upon arrival. That is when I started noticing the pattern in the wars themselves, not the causes or the outcomes, but the timing. Between 1780 and 1850, every major empire on Earth was simultaneously engaged in territorial expansion into the same regions. Russia was moving east and south. Britain was pushing into Central Asia. France was expanding into North Africa. The United States was racing westward, and China was consolidating its western borders. All at the same time, all with a sense of urgency, as if there were a deadline no one acknowledged. Official history calls this the natural progression of empire, the industrial age demanding resources, or the Enlightenment producing explorers. But that explanation requires you to ignore one thing. The cities were already there. They weren't ruins or archaeological sites. They were functional infrastructure. They were roads that bore the weight of modern military use without recent construction, drainage systems that worked before engineers arrived, and plazas paved with stone at a scale no local quarry could have produced. The survey teams didn't build them, they found them. Let's focus on the decade between 1810 and 1820. In 1811, the United States and Britain were fighting over the American interior. We are taught the War of 1812 was about naval rights and national sovereignty. That may be true, but it doesn't explain why both sides fought so desperately for inland territories with no strategic naval value. In these territories, frontier surveys discovered engineered stone roads running through supposedly uninhabited wilderness, roads that didn't appear on any map and led to sites with foundations and leveled earth. The war ended, the roads were used, and their origins were never recorded. In 1812, Napoleon's Grand Army marched into Russia. Historians cite blockades and alliances, but the geography tells a different story. Napoleon didn't march toward St. Petersburg, the seat of real power. He marched toward Moscow through territories labeled on maps as former Tartary. Private memoirs from French officers described moving through abandoned infrastructure, not ruins, but intact standing buildings and roads, as if the civilization that occupied them had simply stopped being there. The soldiers weren't surprised. They noted pre-existing construction as routinely as they noted the weather. To understand this, we have to look at what Tartary actually was. It wasn't a myth. It was labeled geographic and political entity appearing in atlases from the 1500s through the late 1700s. It was treated with the same certainty as France or Spain. Then, in the decades following 1780, it disappeared. The official explanation is that it was a vague designation replaced by accurate ones as exploration improved. But for that to be true, the territories must have been empty. Otherwise, there would have been records of treaties, cultural exchanges, or resistance. Instead, we see a pattern of arrival and attribution, empires arriving and claiming existing infrastructure as their own. By 1820, Russian imperial forces were consolidating control over Central Asia, moving through land labeled former Tartary. Records describe a landscape of cities without populations, intact buildings, functioning wells, and organized street plans, all empty. They weren't destroyed, they were just abandoned. The administrators didn't investigate, they occupied, cataloged, and attributed. The buildings became Russian architecture, and the origin question was closed. If you map the conflicts between 1780 and 1850, they cluster in specific regions: the Central Asian steppe, the American interior, North Africa, and the western Chinese frontier. These are territories that had no significant industrial resources to justify military investment, yet every empire wanted them simultaneously. Why fight over empty cities? Because they are inheritance, ready-made civilizational infrastructure at a scale that would take generations to replicate is enormously valuable. The wars were not about conquest over living populations, they were wars of attribution, violence to determine who gets to write their name on what was already standing. The Napoleonic Wars, the War of 1812, and the American westward expansion are all taught as separate conflicts. What they share is geography, specifically the geography of former Tartary territories, and timing. The evidence suggests a specific timeline. Before 1780, these territories functioned with their own sophisticated infrastructure. Between 1780 and 1800, something ended abruptly. The cities went empty and the populations vanished, but the roads and buildings remained. Between 1800 and 1850, surrounding empires discovered what was available. This wasn't coordinated planning, it was the logic of expansion. When something is there to be taken, everyone moves at once. After 1850, the attribution was complete. The maps were redrawn, buildings were given new names, and the official history was written. We built this. The field reports noting prior works were filed away, and the soldiers' memoirs were left untranslated. I keep returning to a British survey report from 1817 in Central Asia. The leader described a building of such scale that his team camped inside it. He wrote a line that didn't make it into the published account. This was not built recently, and it was not abandoned recently, but neither is it old. To a trained geologist, not old meant the stone still held its precise cut. It was recent history. Yet the population responsible had no name. What's most disturbing isn't a single document, but the coordination of the pattern. Surveyors from America, Britain, Russia, and France, men with no contact, all noted the same thing: infrastructure they didn't build. The wars make sense if the prize made sense. I can't prove what ended Tartary, but the pattern suggests a rush, the kind that happens when territory is suddenly empty, and the question of who gets to inherit it must be answered before someone else gets there first. Ask yourself why the major powers were all so urgent about the same empty territories. Ask why frontier surveys turn up infrastructure with no recorded origin. Ask why the buildings in official histories of every empire from this period feature architectural proportions that the timelines can't adequately explain. The difference between the map of 1770 and 1850 isn't conquest, it's replacement. The history we have isn't an account of what was built, it's an account of what was claimed. Beneath the founding myths, the original record remains. Prior works. 3 empires, 10 decades, and 1 silence. What did they find when they got there that required every single one of them to agree it had always been theirs?